A single gunshot breaks the silence, and with it, the course of history is forever altered. Long before flags were raised or nations were named, ordinary people made an extraordinary decision to cross a vast, unforgiving ocean in search of a life they could call their own. They weren't conquerors at first. They were dreamers, risk-takers, families, farmers, and believers who knew that staying behind meant surrendering their future. What they couldn't yet see was that this pursuit of freedom would one day force them to stand against the most powerful empire the world had ever known. In the early 17th century, crossing the Atlantic was a gamble with death. A journey that now takes just hours once demanded months of endurance aboard overcrowded ships, battered by storms, disease, and hunger. Many never survived the passage, and those who did arrive weakened, disoriented, and unprepared for what awaited them. Yet they kept coming. They were driven by stories of a vast continent overflowing with forests, rivers, fertile land, and untold wealth beneath the soil. North America represented possibility itself, a place where land was abundant and a person's future wasn't dictated by birth or title. But when settlers like John Rolfe arrived in Jamestown, the dream quickly collapsed into a nightmare. Hundreds had come before him, yet only a handful remained alive. Starvation, disease, and despair ruled the settlement. The colonists had built their outpost in the heart of a powerful Native American world, without understanding the land, the climate, or the people who already lived there. Hunger drove them to unimaginable acts, and survival became their only goal. Unlike many before him, Rolfe didn't see Jamestown as a lost cause. He didn't come to plunder and flee. He came with a plan. In secret, he carried tobacco seeds that should never have left Spanish-controlled territories, seeds that could cost a man his life if discovered. And in the warm, fertile lands near the Chesapeake Bay, those seeds flourished. Tobacco transformed Jamestown almost overnight. What had once been a place of death became a center of profit and opportunity. Wealth flowed in, new settlers arrived, and the colony finally took root. But this success carried a dark cost. The intense labor demands fueled the rise of slavery, binding the ideals of freedom and the practice of exploitation together from the very beginning of America's story. Further north, a different group of settlers arrived with different ambitions. The Pilgrims didn't cross the ocean for profit, but for faith. Seeking religious freedom, they landed far from their intended destination in the dead of winter on a harsh and unfamiliar coast. The land was unforgiving, the soil poor, and the cold relentless. Disease spread quickly, and within months, more than half of them were dead. Yet those who survived endured. They built shelters, formed families, and created a community rooted in shared belief and mutual dependence. Like Jamestown, Plymouth existed on land that was not empty. Indigenous nations had lived there for generations, though many had already been devastated by European diseases brought years earlier. Against the odds, moments of cooperation emerged. Native peoples taught the settlers how to survive, how to grow food, and how to adapt to the land. For a brief time, survival depended on fragile alliances rather than outright conquest. As the decades passed, the colonies expanded. Ships arrived carrying people from across Europe and Africa, merchants, laborers, enslaved men and women, refugees, and fortune seekers. Farms became towns. Towns became cities. Trade flourished. Timber, fish, crops, and goods flowed across the Atlantic. The colonies grew wealthier, healthier, and more independent. Colonists began to live better than those they had left behind in Europe. They paid fewer taxes, owned land, raised large families, and started to see themselves as something distinct. They were still British subjects, but with each generation, loyalty to the crown weakened. Their identity was no longer tied to a distant king, but to the very land beneath their feet. So when Britain sought to tighten its control and extract more wealth from the colonies, resistance inevitably followed. Taxes imposed without representation sparked outrage. British soldiers filled colonial streets, transforming ports like Boston into occupied cities. Commerce slowed, tempers rose, and resentment turned to defiance. Clashes between civilians and soldiers became a matter of when, not if. When British troops fired into a crowd in Boston, killing unarmed colonists, the incident sent shockwaves through the colonies. Images and accounts of the massacre spread rapidly, turning widespread anger into a sense of unity. For the first time, many colonists began to believe that separation from Britain was not just possible, but necessary. Information became a weapon. Newspapers, pamphlets, and riders on horseback connected distant colonies with remarkable speed. When Britain closed Boston Harbor to punish the rebellion, the message was clear: obey or face ruin. In response, colonial leaders gathered to decide their future. Farmers, lawyers, merchants, and landowners debated fiercely, yet discovered a shared, inescapable truth. An attack on one colony threatened them all. And for the first time, they spoke not as Virginians or New Englanders, but as Americans. When British troops marched toward Lexington and Concord to seize weapons and arrest rebel leaders, ordinary citizens stood in their path. They weren't professional soldiers. They were blacksmiths, farmers, shopkeepers, and apprentices. And they were facing an army hardened by decades of global warfare, the most disciplined fighting force on Earth. No one knows who fired the first shot. But when it rang out across the village green, the world changed forever. That single moment marked the birth of a revolution. What followed was not merely a war, but a transformation. 7 generations after crossing an ocean in search of opportunity, their descendants now fought to defend the right to choose their own destiny. They stood against an empire that did not intend to surrender its colonies easily. The road ahead would be long, violent, and uncertain. But in that moment, standing on village greens and muddy roads, a new idea had taken hold that ordinary people, united by belief rather than bloodline, could challenge empires and create a nation from the strength of their own will. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more.